how have they figured it out? So that's where I really struggle with a lot of these people. They're very dishonest, and it really pisses me off. And so I try to always just preach the truth and be like, no, you're not telling the full story. So
we have a separate series called Dishing on Dish, where we talk about primarily on food, and Stephen knows way more about wine. For me, I don't drink anymore, but even when I did, I could tell when wine was bad, but I didn't know why it was bad. I could be like, okay, this is pretty decent wine. And then somebody who knows more about it would be like, yeah, that's good. But then if it's bad, there's a level that I think the average person can tell. But the industry definitely, there's a lot of people who seem to be a lot more interested in wine. Now I see a lot of these companies like shipping wine all over the world and things like this, different areas. I think even in Kenya, they're starting to do a wine industry. I know some places in South Africa is now doing like internationally recognized wine and things like that. So it's an industry that's exploding. So I can imagine there's a lot of interest coming in, a lot of new clients, new customers. You'd mentioned that you had some frustration with the liquor systems. So could you tell us a bit about that? And also, is there ways for the people who actually do want to actually get the actual good natural wines and find the people who are not doing these shady things? Are there any systems or sites or locations that you think are doing it that in a good way that people who are interested in getting wine would be able to go to and find that? Or do you do it yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So with respect to the liquor laws in Canada, they're just extremely archaic. A number of them date all the way back to like the early 1900s, and they're just structured. They're basically monopolies, and they're just state-run entities. They prohibit choice, innovation, competition. And I didn't really realize how severe it was until I moved to Ontario, because every province is different. BC is semi-private, so some government-run entities and then also private. I also lived in Alberta for a large chunk of my life, and that was 100% private, and that was the best because obviously like you could find whatever you were looking for. And then I moved to Ontario and I was like, oh my God, like people have Stockholm syndrome here. Like it's insane. And when people sort of start to try and incite reform by way of privatization, the belief systems that people have, they're like, this is an alt-right conspiracy theory. And I'm like, what? Like, are you guys okay? Like, we can't even access wine province to province. So there was this really old law, Bill C-91, that prohibited interprovincial shipping. That was abolished in 2019. So then everybody thought like, oh, great. Now we can legally ship wine to each other. No. So all that happened was the buck was passed federally to the provinces, and specifically Ontario and Quebec came out in full force, threatened jail time, $100,000s of dollars worth of fines if you try to ship wine direct to consumer in these provinces. And so it's just so stupid. And not only that, they treat any import, whether it's from Italy or BC or any other province, the same. So every single bottle of wine that lands in Ontario is marked up 72%. And that's even before freight or taxes or anything or commission. So wine is really expensive here. Canadian wine is really expensive in Canada. Like it's so fucking stupid. So that's why I started my wine club. I'm just sort of skirting around the rules, and I exist in a gray area. And the irony of the whole thing is that all these wineries who cannot participate in these structures and systems because it's a pay to play system. You got to be like a big kind of like conglomerate to be able to afford to buy shelf space. They just ship direct to consumers anyway, and they use Canada Post to do it, which is also a government owned entity. It's like, it's so dumb. It's so stupid. Like
you had said to me too, like a lot of the wines that like I'll buy at Trader Joe's are a lot pricier there, right? Because of tariffs and things. So like there's certain wines that I'll get at Trader Joe's for like $12-13, but you said they're even more in Canada just because of all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so stupid. And then people will argue like, oh, Canadian wine is so expensive. And it's like, well, yeah, look at what we're up against. And that's even outside of like the price of land. Land is so expensive here. Like we don't have the benefit of like generations owned property that's just passed down, right? We'll get there in a couple hundred years, but we're in our infancy, like in terms of quality wine production from Canada, maybe 40 years. And even then that's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, because I would say it's only really gotten to the point in terms of like a qualitative perspective where it could compete globally in like the last decade. And that's like me being really nice. So yeah, it's challenging because people don't take Canada seriously. They're starting to now, but they haven't for a long time for a whole host of different reasons. So it's, I remember I was talking to a colleague of mine at a trade event, and he was like, keep like fighting the good fight, because like understand that it's going to be an uphill battle if you're going to like take on this whole Canadian wine thing. And I'm like, okay, I like a challenge. So
yeah, because contrast that with Europe, where it's like they've been producing wine since Roman times or earlier, and I mean, obviously they got stricter as time went on, but it's like, from what you're saying, this is almost like that in its earlier stages. Like they're not. It's going to be a long time before they like match Europe in terms of, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, what are some good places that you think people can go to find good access to wine? Like, we'll have the links below. These, you can share some links. Definitely, all the links to your content, your stuff's going to be somewhere wherever you listen to this. But where do you think is a good way to get past some of these the shysters and get past some of the government things? Like you said, there's gray areas and there's newer ways to actually get access to good quality wine out there in the world.
Yeah, like make relationships with like your local bottle shops, I would say. And my business partner and I were talking about this. The merchant has to be the most honest person in the supply chain, because if, say, you purchase something and then you don't like it, you're not going to trust that opinion ever again, right? Whereas like the winemaker could say like, oh, it was a bad vintage, or we were short staffed, or whatever, you know what I mean? So definitely bottle shops, but also building relationships with like your local importer. And that's what I've done. I've just like skirted around like the LCBO entirely and just found the people who are importing the wines, because they're the ones doing the vetting and they're the ones building the relationships and tasting stuff. And then also just like bringing it in based upon, their assessment of quality. In terms of like actual websites, sadly, with respect to Canadian wine, there's not a lot of voices that are otherwise like sponsored or like bought and paid for, kind of like shills. It's so fragmented, like regionally you can find stuff, but even then it's very bureaucratic kind of structures where it's like wineries pay to be members of these associations that market on their behalf, but it's like, they're not telling the full picture. And then I also get really frustrated when I see like these wine awards, and I've judged in these wine awards before, and it's like you're tasting sometimes 200 wines in a day. And then even then, it's only a very small snapshot of, say a handful of wineries that have submitted these samples to participate. It's just another marketing exercise. So it's like you're kind of like picking the best of the worst, Yeah. So I don't know, it's a very time intensive, like laborious hobby. But that's why I'm trying to sort of like be that bridge. And like, I just relaunched my website because I'm trying to sort of just have all this content live in one place where you can be like, okay, what are the wineries I can trust that are transparent and honest? And what wine bars could I go to that are like pouring examples of this? And then just bringing in contributors from like all these different regions and locations and having all of this stuff live in one place. It's very much a work in progress still, and it's nowhere near where I want it to be, but that's where I want to go at some point, because everything is just, it's all just an agenda to like make money, and it's not, there's nothing real, and it really bothers me. And it's like, maybe I'll get to a point where I need to start charging for this stuff too. But I talk to enough people on social media that I know that there's a demand for this. And like you said, Silas, there's the curiosity and just engagement and passion for learning about wine has exploded. And so there's so much opportunity to participate in this space right now, I think. So.
Yeah, you definitely. We'll talk after this and see if you can come on and help Stephen out a bit. Thank you for listening. This has been a clip from an actual longer recording that I'll try to leave a link to on the screen or somewhere around here where you're listening to this.
Presents. Peasants. Okay. Okay.